In 1988, I was an anxious, immature, timid, 19-year-old college student in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I had recently experienced a devastating blow to my faith journey. I was confused and discouraged. And one humid afternoon, I found myself sitting in a church service. And onto the stage walked a middle-aged, gray-haired, soft-spoken man with a beautiful British accent wearing a clerical collar. His collar intrigued me because I grew up Pentecostal, and the only people wearing and sporting clerical collars were priests, and in my opinion in those days, priests were most likely going to go to hell. So why in the world was he at our church bringing the message for the day? But when the gentleman opened his mouth, I was hooked. I sat spellbound and riveted to my seat for the next 70 minutes. Not only did he captivate me with his posture, his dress, and his voice, but his message was unlike anything I had ever heard. He is one of the reasons I am here today. His message that afternoon rides on the list of the greatest messages I have ever heard. He took my hand and gently walked me through the prodigal son story in Luke 15. A couple hours later, the scales from my eyes fell off, and I saw grace like I had never seen it before. It would take another 20 years to unpack and absorb all of what he said, and I'm confident I continue to miss pieces of truth he dropped that day. His name is Malcolm Smith, and he penned several books throughout his ministry and his life. And over 50 years of ministry, he's traveled around the world, and most people don't even know who he is. One book titled The Lost Secret of the New Covenant, here's a picture of it right here, is stunning. I picked it up, read it, devoured it over and again, making notes. And today I have the honor of bringing you some of what I've learned through that book. And I try to give credit where credit is due, and a lot of credit today goes to what I've learned from Malcolm, and I'm honored. I want to begin today unusual. I want to begin by reading to you a letter from a desperate Christian leader written to Malcolm years ago. And I want you to sit back. This is a lengthy letter. I want you to sit back and relax. And I want you to listen not only to what this Christian leader says, but I want you to feel the desperation in his words. And I want you to see whether or not a few of you, or maybe many of you, can locate yourself within the words of what this person says. Dear Malcolm, you do not know who I am, and I have never met you, but a friend of mine told me he has been greatly helped by your teaching, and he gave me your address and urged me to write. I trust you will read this letter and give me some answers. I am writing to you because my Christian life is a disaster, and I have nowhere to turn. I'm in a position of leadership in my church, and if I shared with a pastor or any of the deacons the way my life is, I do not know what would happen. I know I would no longer be welcome in the church. I pray that you will read this and be able to help me. Let me say up front that if you saw me in the context of the church, in the weekly meetings, in social gatherings, with other church members, or teaching my adult Sunday school class, you would never imagine that I'm not the person you see. I did not set out to be a hypocrite. From the very first, I gave my very best to live for Jesus. I have disciplined myself to pray every day and read and even memorize the Scripture. I honestly set out to live every week for Jesus, but I fail every time. The life that my family and the people I work with see is very different from the one that is portrayed before the church. I have a terrible temper that I cannot control, however much I try. I wrestle every day with lustful thoughts, and when I'm out of town on business, I watch pornographic movies in the hotel room. I have a brother I have not spoken to in 20 years and cannot bring myself to forgive because of the betrayal of confidence that deeply hurt me. If Christianity is loving as Jesus loved, then count me out. But above all, I do not love God. I do not find joy in my prayer or Bible reading. It is something I do because I have been told that it will nurture my Christian life, but my heart is not in keeping with His commands. And being with Him, in fact, there are times I have to admit that I envy the world. They look a lot happier than I ever feel. Maybe I have continued to live this way for the last 10 years because in the church I can get by with the veneer that satisfies my peers and leaders. You know what I mean by veneer, the rules of the subculture we evangelicals are a part of. I went over them the other day. We are the people who do not do certain things. We do not go to certain places. We do not smoke or drink liquor or do not dress like the world, especially our poor women. As long as I keep those rules, everyone thinks I'm a great Christian. But I miserably fail, Malcolm. The truth is, I do not love God. I would be more correct to say that I am afraid of Him. And I go to church and pray because I am afraid that if I do not, I will go to hell. I look around at the others in my church, even my friends, and I wonder if they are living the same craziness that I am. They do not know what I'm really like. Do they scream at their kids and slip pornography whenever no one's watching? Do they go through all the words and motions on Sunday while their hearts are untouched and without the love of God? Is their religious life like mine, just a millimeter thick mask over the real person underneath? There have been times when I think that I have had an experience with God. At special meetings when hands are laid on me, I have felt a warm glow inside, the flickering of a joy that has lasted for a couple of weeks, and I have wondered if that is how real Christians feel all the time. At times, I have heard a message that lays out a formula for living a victorious Christian life, and I have tried, but it feels artificial when I have tried to live it out with the guys at the office. In the last weeks, I have looked at myself and evaluated my life for what it really is. And it has left me in utter despair. This letter is my last attempt to ask someone I trust if the Christian life can really be lived by ordinary people. Tell me honestly, Malcolm, is it for a few unusual people who do not have the desires that we have, who really do hate the world and love God? If my experience of Christianity is as good as it gets, then I will quietly walk away from it all. I can no longer live incredibly shallow and utterly meaningless. Thank you. Can we get real today? Many of us gathered in this room and watching online think and feel exactly the same. We sing songs together in church. We pray together. We serve together, yet we live discouraged, confused, and defeated. We hide behind masks of Christian service, going through the motions, the rules, the parts, keeping everybody convinced we love God. So why is it, after all these years, do we still seem so shallow and empty? Is it possible, and this is what I want to talk about today, this is what I'm talking about in this entire series, is it possible, after all these years, after all the classes we've joined, after all the sermons we've heard, after all the revivals we've attended, after all the efforts we've made, is it possible we still have never heard, nor do we know or understand the gospel? I say it is possible. In fact, not only is it possible, I would almost guarantee you that there are people in this room, people coming into the second service, people watching online this week or a month from now, who have sat in church their entire life, who've attended Sunday school classes, who've gone to special meetings, who have done all the things that Christians are supposed to do, but have never heard nor understood the gospel one time in their entire lives. And you say, how is that possible, Scott? Part of the answer is found in the weekly spiritual diet of a lot of evangelical Christians. For millions of people, church is basically a call to escape hell and get to heaven after death. For millions of people across this nation, that is what church is. That is basically what sermons are. It is just basically a way to help you make sure when you die, because it could be tonight, you will go to heaven and you will avoid hell. But how to live in the power of the Spirit and walk as Jesus walked and love as Jesus loved, rarely is that discussed. Rarely is that talked about. Rarely is that ever presented in a way that you can understand it and live it out in churches all across this nation. See, here's what I know about many of you. We do not understand how to walk within the truth of the gospel. We do not understand how to walk within a Christianity that works in the here and now. We do not understand how to live out our faith in the nitty-gritty of life, in the going to school tomorrow, in going to work, in driving, in being in a hotel 500 miles away from home, how we actually live out our faith within our marriages, with our kids. We do not understand how because we've never heard the gospel laid out in front of us in a way that we can not only understand it, but grasp it and begin to walk within the good news of Christ. Say, Scott, why is that true? Why do we not get it? Because people attending church week after week have never heard nor understood the gospel. Listen to me very carefully. The gospel is not how to get to heaven when you die. The gospel is not how to avoid hell. The gospel is not the details of end-time prophecies. The gospel is not manipulating a crowd into hooping and hollering and waving their hands with emotionalism. The gospel is not guilting people into living right. The gospel is not holiness codes. The gospel is not conservative or progressive politics. The gospel is not Baptist, Pentecostal, Church of Christ, or Catholic. Say, what is the gospel, Scott? The gospel, and this is what I want to spend my time on today, the gospel is an announcement. The gospel is an announcement. Go into all the world and announce something has happened. Announce something has occurred. The gospel is an announcement of God's covenant with us. We're going to talk about that in a minute. God's covenant with us and with all people, all languages, cultures, and tribes. Are you a people? You have some language, you are some culture, you are in some tribe. And how we walk in authority, power, and peace in the midst of a crooked and perverse system. The gospel is an announcement of a covenant God made with us before we were ever born. And when we understand the covenant that He has made with us and that His covenant will be fulfilled in spite of us, we can begin to walk with power, authority, joy, and peace right in the middle of a perverse and crooked system all around us. Now, what I'm getting ready to teach you, covenant, is going to be radical for a few. In fact, some of you will flinch. A few of you will disagree. Some will think it's too good to be true. Some of it will sit sideways with you, but that's okay. Anytime you hear unfiltered, unadulterated, pure, 200 proof truth, it's a challenge to swallow. It burns going down. But I encourage you to drink it. Drink it all. Drink it straight. And don't you dare mix anything with it, and don't you dare drink anything behind it. And if you drink it straight with no chaser, you'll get drunk on grace. And eventually, eventually you will stagger home free. The concept of covenant is almost unknown in our world today. But the concept of covenants has been known and documented in ancient societies for hundreds of years. I want to define covenant for you. Here's a great definition of covenant. A covenant is a binding, and you've got to pay attention to every word I say. Today is not the day you go to sleep, okay? When other speakers are up here, snore away, all right? But when I'm up here, no, I'm just kidding. Today's one of those messages, every single thing I say depends on what I've said before, okay? So you got to pay attention. Every word matters. A covenant is a binding, unbreakable obligation between two parties based on unconditional love, sealed by blood and sacred oath that creates a relationship with each party is bound by specific undertakings on each other's behalf. You're going to understand this more as we go. Next line. The parties to the covenant place themselves under the penalty of divine retribution should they later attempt to avoid those undertakings. It is a relationship that can only be broken by death. Covenants, for the most part, are unequal. What does that mean? They are made one-sidedly. In other words, they are initiated by a person who is vastly superior in power and authority and graciously imposed on a person of lesser power and in position for one's greater good. In other words, someone who has immense power like a king, someone who has immense power like a very wealthy landowner would strike a covenant with his people who were much lesser in power, lesser in money, didn't have all of the authority that he had, and it would be stricken, it would be made in order to help the lesser person. That's typically how a covenant was made. The word covenant might seem strange to you, because we don't use the word much in our modern society, and even when we do, we often confuse it with a contract. But let's remove the idea of contract immediately. A covenant is totally different than a contract. You need to know this before we go anywhere else in this message. A covenant is not a contract. Very important. A contract basically is, I'll do my part if you do your part, right? And if you don't do your part, I'm not obligated to do my part. So we enter into this mutual agreement that you will do your part, I will do my part. I'll give you $100, you will give me back $100 worth of product. But if you don't give me the product, I'm not giving you the money. And if you don't give me the money, I'm not going to give you the product. That's a contract. And if you break it, then we might have to go to court and settle who broke the contract and who didn't hold their word and on and on. A covenant is not a contract. A covenant is made with an oath. An oath is a solemn affirmation, a binding of oneself to the fulfillment of the words spoken within this covenant by appealing to God himself. The person initiating the covenant is saying, if I do not fulfill my word, may God judge me. And once a covenant is made with an oath, listen, this is extremely important. A covenant is non-negotiable, and it cannot be altered. Once you enter into a covenant, even if the other person doesn't hold their end of the deal, you still hold your end of the deal. You cannot alter it. You cannot break it. Very important. Every covenant in the Old Testament times contained the promises each party made to the other and the responsibilities each took with the benefit of the other person in view. Let me give you an example. And we're going to get into this in just a second. I'm excited about this. 1 Samuel 20. Jonathan made a covenant with David. And David swore to bless Jonathan. Here's the covenant they made. This is part of it. 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 14. Jonathan is speaking. And may you treat me, he's talking to David, may you treat me with the faithful love of the Lord as long as I live. But if I die, and we're going to come back to this in a minute. If I die, Jonathan is saying, if I die, David, you and I are entering into a covenant. If I die, may you treat my family with this faithful love. In other words, you pass down all the covenant that you and I are making onto my kids. Even when the Lord destroys all your enemies from the face of the earth, no matter what happens in the future, the covenant you and I are making, you fulfill it to me. But if I die, you fulfill it to my children's children's children. Just hold that. In the making of a covenant, there was always, and this is how a covenant was made. This is so sweet. In the making of a covenant, there was always the shedding of blood. An animal, now those of you who hate the slaying of animals, and I'm not partial to that either, but that was an animal. Anyway, an animal was slain during the making of a covenant. An animal was slain, and its carcass was slit down the middle into two halves. This is how serious a covenant was in Old Testament times. The parties making the covenant would walk through the bloody path between the pieces of the divided animal. So they would take an animal, they would kill it, slice it in half, put one half of the animal here, the other half of the animal there, and the two people making the covenant would walk in between the halves of the split animal, and they were proclaiming that they were entering into a death and were journeying into a new life. Basically what they were saying is we are dying to our self-interests alone, and we are passing through this death into a new relationship of union, and we are coming out the other side as friends in covenant union. Basically, we were taking this animal, split it in half, set it to the side, one side here, one side there. We are joining together in this covenant, and we are walking through the animal pieces, and we are dying to our own self-interest. And when we come out the other side, we now live for each other. They also would shed their own blood, usually drawn from the right arm or hand. They would slice their hand, slice their arm. They would then join hands and arms and lift their arms up and let the blood drip down their hands, calling upon God to be a witness to the covenant they are making today. The scars eventually that would heal and become scars, the wounds that would heal and become scars, sealed. They looked as seals. They were basically like tattoos. They were seals, and they could proclaim the covenant they had made to all people. Do you see the wounds on my hands? Go look at my friend. He has the same kind of wounds on his hands. We are in covenant together. Then, after that, they would always refer to themselves as friends from that point on. Blood brothers. You've heard that said before. And every covenant, after all that was done, they slit the animal, set it aside, walk through the bloody path, slit their hands, their arms, hold their arms up, let the blood drip down, swear to God, if you will, make a covenant with God that if we do not fulfill what we said, may God judge us, walk through, the wounds would be there. After all that was done, they would then share in a meal together, declaring the covenant valid and effective and functioning from this day forward. The place where the covenant was made was always hallowed as a memorial site of the two parties becoming one. To enter into a covenant was to enter into a new situation, becoming part of a relationship best understood as a family, not based on birth ties, but based on a commitment to love each other freely in sacred oath. The oath created a new family. You begin to look at this person you've entered into a covenant with as closer than your own real brothers and sisters. In fact, among the Arabs to this day, there is a saying that says blood is thicker than milk. You've heard it said before, blood is thicker than water. They would say blood is thicker than milk, meaning that those bound by the blood of a covenant are held in a stronger bond than those who have drunk from the same mother's milk. That's the way they look at covenant. The new covenant is foreshadowed in many of the Old Testament stories. One of the stories, and this is what I want to give you, is scattered throughout 1st and 2nd Samuel. It is the story of a covenant made between Jonathan, I just alluded to it a moment ago, the son of Saul. Jonathan is the son of Saul. the king of Israel at the time, and the crown prince of Israel, David. David, who was at this time serving as a general in Saul's army, eventually, after Saul and Jonathan dies, David becomes king. Saul, the man who is the king of Israel at this time, is a very complicated and tragic person. Although chosen by God to lead Israel, he disobeys God. He becomes increasingly paranoid and deranged, and eventually Saul goes and seeks consultation with witches. He just gets lower and lower and lower. It's a fascinating story if you read the life of Saul. Jonathan is Saul's son. I want you to picture this. Saul's the deranged king of Israel. He's nuts. He's lost his mind. He's mentally unhealthy. He's consulting witches instead of consulting God. He has gone a long ways from where God had called him. Jonathan is Saul's son. He is completely different than his dad. He loves God with all of his heart. He wants to do exactly what God has called him to do. David, the eventual king of Israel, and Jonathan are close friends. So much so that they make a covenant with themselves. That's what I just read to you a moment ago. Verse 3 of 1 Samuel 18. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off his robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Why would he do all of that? He was basically saying, I'm laying down all of my ability to fight you. I'm laying down all of my ability to hurt you. I'm giving everything up. I'm coming to you completely vulnerable. I have no sword. I have no way to protect myself. I'm completely emptying myself in front of you. Verse 8. There we go. As for you, show kindness to your servant, for you have brought him into a covenant with you before the Lord. If I am guilty, then kill me yourself. Why hand me over to your father? Verse 14. But show me unfailing kindness, like the Lord's kindness as long as I live, so that I may not be killed. And do not ever cut off your kindness from my family, not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth. Verse 16. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord call David's enemies to count. And Jonathan had David reaffirm his oath out of love for him, because he loved him as himself. Verse 42, Jonathan said to David, go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants. How long? How long? Very important that you catch that word. The Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever. Then David left, and Jonathan went back to town. I know that's a lot of reading, a lot of stuff from the Old Testament. They do exactly what I just said. They take animals, they split them, they walk through, they cut their arms, they hold them up, they make a covenant between themselves that they are absolutely united forever and ever. And not only will this go from David to Jonathan, but it'll even go from David to Jonathan's kids, or from Jonathan to David's kids. This covenant is stronger than the blood, the milk that we drank together as children, even the blood of being a relative. We are making a covenant that will outlast our entire life on this earth. It will be even passed down to our kids. But Saul, remember, Jonathan's father, king of Israel, is jealous of David. He is fearful David will overthrow him. His jealousy turned to obsession, and he tried to kill David. But Jonathan was convinced that not only did the people of Israel love David, but that God wanted David on the throne. So again, Jonathan befriends David with this covenant, loves him, and it shows the character of Jonathan. Because who was supposed to become heir to the throne of Israel when Saul dies? Jonathan. But Jonathan loves David so much, and he's entered this covenant with him, that he will even step aside and let somebody else take the throne of Israel, and not even allow himself to take the throne, because he loves David so much and believes in David so much and knows that God wants David to be on the throne. So Jonathan, this covenant he's made with David goes so deep, Jonathan is willing to step out of the way and allow David to usurp the throne if and when Saul dies. And you'll see that in 1 Samuel 23, 17, and 18. Don't be afraid, Jonathan says. My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. I'll protect you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Think about that. Who is supposed to be on the throne? Jonathan. But Jonathan loves David and has made a covenant with David, so much so that he is willing to step aside and allow David to become the king. And he says, I'll be second to you. I'll submit myself to you. This is the son of the king. And he's willing to submit himself to David. Even my father Saul knows this. The two of them made a covenant before the Lord. They reaffirmed their covenant. Then Jonathan went home, but David remained at Horsheth. That's the last long reading I'm going to do. This right here, and this is all going to come together in a minute, this is the heart of the covenant. Jonathan laid down his throne and proclaimed David as king. Time passes, and the two young teenagers grow into manhood because they're teenagers at this time. They grow into manhood and married, and Jonathan has kids. Okay? Years before his children were born, Jonathan and David make this covenant. They grow up, they have children. The old enemies of Israel, if you've studied the Old Testament at all, you know the Philistines. The Philistines attack Israel again. It was a day of great defeat for Israel, and both King Saul and Prince Jonathan are killed. The near Middle East at this time in 1000 BC was a violent place. The first act of a conqueror, whenever he took over a country, was to assemble all the family of the king and kill them all. So basically, when the Philistines took over Israel, they killed Saul, they killed Jonathan, and they said, bring his wives, bring their children, bring everybody that has anything to do with being in relation with King Saul, and we are going to kill every single one of them. Why? Because they didn't want any of them to think they could rise up and overthrow this new king. So they wanted to wipe out the entire family. It was a brutal and violent place. So they assembled all of Saul's family. Jonathan, all the kids. Jonathan was already killed. He was killed in the battle. But they assembled all the other people to try to kill every single one of them, so none of them would ever think that they could possibly outdo him or rise up and take the throne back. Here's what happened. One of the royal nurses knew this was going to happen. They had already called everybody to come together, and they were going to slaughter every single one of them. One of the royal nurses rushed into the nursery where Jonathan's children were and grabbed one of the little boys, one of the princes, okay, grandchild of Saul, Jonathan's son. The nurse picks him up and begins to run from the Philistines. This little boy, his name is Mephibosheth. While the nurse is running with Mephibosheth, all this is in the Old Testament. I didn't know this story was in the Old Testament. It's all there, okay? Just read it. It's all there, right? She picks him up, and while she's running with him, she falls. When she falls, the baby comes out of her arms and smashes his legs. And the baby never walks again. But she saved his life. So she got him away from the Philistines. She takes him to a forgotten city by the name of Lodabar. Okay? Let me set this up. Saul dead. Jonathan is dead. The Philistines gather up all of Jonathan's family, all of Saul's family, to murder every single one of them, so none of them will ever think they will ever rise up and take the Philistines over. This nurse knows what's happening. She runs in. She can't take all the kids, but she picks up one of the children named Mephibosheth, and she runs out the door. And on her way to protect this child, she trips, falls, breaks the child's legs. At that time, they didn't have any way of resetting the bones and taking care of the legs of this child. And the child loses his ability to ever use his legs again. He is lame, but he is alive. She takes him to an obscure village named Lodabar, so the Philistines will never find him. He's in hiding. Nobody knows where he is. He is left in this little city called Lodabar. Does everybody follow me so far? If anybody is snoring beside you, you wake them up, punch them, and tell them that, yeah, they got to think a little bit today. Yeah, they got to go a little deeper than normal. This is not hooping and hollering, but all this is going to come together today. And I pray to God you walk out of here drunk. On grace. Some of you are like, I didn't know we could drink in here. Okay, anyway. All right, everybody got what I'm saying? Good. Eventually, David becomes king of Israel. Long story, overtakes the Philistine. He becomes king of Israel. Years go by. David never forgot the covenant he made with Jonathan when they were teenagers. Because you see, a covenant is non-negotiable and cannot be altered. Once you make it, you make it. The scars are in your arms. The blood has been shed. It's all been done. You can't change it. You bound yourself to this covenant forever, and not only to the person, but to the person's children's children. David becomes king, and he never forgets the covenant he made with Jonathan. When he had established his kingdom, he began searching for any of Jonathan's sons that he might fulfill the oath to and show the covenant of kindness to. This was not an easy task. No one believed, very important, no one believed David intended good. Because what does a conqueror do when a conqueror becomes king? A conqueror removes all people who might eventually usurp authority again. So what do the people think David is doing? He is searching for maybe one of Jonathan's kids, maybe one of Saul's grandchildren. And why? To rid the earth of them so that he can always remain king. So nobody believed that Jonathan was looking for any of Jonathan's children. Out of the goodness of his heart, they thought he was looking for them to kill them, but they don't know that David made a covenant with Jonathan. In those days, the expected action would be for David to kill all the house of Saul. But they had forgotten. They didn't know about the covenant. All right, here it is. The story is told in 2 Samuel 9. David finally finds where lame Mephibosheth is living. How he found out, he just asked around, he began to search. Finally, he locates this one boy that was taken years ago to this little town called Lodabar. And when he finds out that Mephibosheth, a lame little boy at that time, has now become a man, he's on crutches, he can't walk, he's living in Lodabar, and David finds out that this young man is the descendant of Jonathan, it's his child. He sends men to Lodabar to get Mephibosheth and bring him back to Jerusalem. Now, I want you to imagine how Mephibosheth felt. His entire life, he has been lame. He has not been able to do the things that other people have been able to do. Every single morning he gets up, he remembers that his legs are lame. He can't run when he was a little boy. He couldn't play as a teenager. He couldn't get the jobs that other men. Plus, not only is he lame, but his father was set to become the king of Israel. His grandfather was the king of Israel. He has not only lost his grandfather, not only has he lost his dad, he has lost his chances of eventually becoming the king of Israel. And instead, he is sitting in Lodabar with his legs unable to work, and an impostor by the name of David is on the throne. How do you think Mephibosheth felt? How would you feel? Men show up at Mephibosheth's, you say that 12 times, Mephibosheth's house, and they knock on the door. And people look out and they see the regal attire of David's men. And no doubt these men were dressed. They had swords, they had armor, they had everything that the king's men would have. And they ask for Mephibosheth. What do you think Mephibosheth is thinking at this moment? My life's over. I have lived all these years free. It's not been a fun life. It's not been an easy life, but at least I have been able to breathe every day. But it's over now. David has tracked me down, and he has done what every other leader who has ever lived has done. He has come to eradicate the earth of anybody who might eventually try to take back the throne. Mephibosheth gets onto the horse, or he gets into the wagon, whatever it is that they're going to cart him back to Jerusalem in, and they take him all the way back to the palace where David is. And when he walks into the room, He falls down on his face, afraid of what is going to happen. He takes his crutches, he throws them aside. He sees David sitting on the throne, and he kneels down and eventually falls down onto his face, and he is waiting for David to give the execution call. And right when he's on his face, on the floor, David speaks and says, "Don't be afraid." Just stop right there. Do you have any idea how many times Jesus says, "Fear not"? In fact, it is the most tracked command in all of Scripture, God saying, "Fear not." Do you know that the very first thing Jesus says when he comes out of the tomb is, "Don't be afraid"? When you are bowing down and you have nothing to prove and you have nothing to do and your feet are lame and you can't run like everybody else and you can't walk like everybody else and you think your life is almost over. It is getting ready to be cut away from you and you're never going to breathe again. You're never going to see again. You're never going to live again. You're never going to see your family. You're never going to see your kids. You're never going to live the rest of your life out. David, who has the power to take your life, looks at you and says, "Don't be afraid." That is the gospel. In your worst moment, don't be afraid. When you are lame, don't be afraid. When you have nothing to offer, don't be afraid. When your entire life is upside down, don't be afraid. When you think you're getting ready to be snuffed out, don't be afraid. When you look down and nothing in your life works, don't be afraid. For I will surely show kindness for the sake of your father, Jonathan. Mephibosheth, here's the gospel. Here's the gospel. If you understood this, we would have revival. Listen, Mephibosheth, it has nothing to do with you. I'm showing kindness for the sake of your father, Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. He was not treated on the basis of his track record of loyalty to David, but on the basis of a covenant entered into before he was born. Do you see that? David accepted him as if he were Jonathan. It had nothing to do with Mephibosheth, nothing to do with his behavior, nothing to do with his love for David, nothing to do with his loyalty to David's throne, nothing to do with the promised future support of David's kingdom. It had nothing to do with Mephibosheth. If you knew Mephibosheth's heart, he didn't love David. He was afraid of David. He wasn't loyal to David. He saw David as an imposter. But David was kind to Mephibosheth, not because of Mephibosheth, but because of the covenant he made before Mephibosheth was even born. It had everything to do with the covenant. 2 Samuel 9. Then Ziba said to the king, "Your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do." Now watch this. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. Oh, and he was lame in both feet. Here's where all this turns to gold. Okay? I'm pouring some grace now, 200 proof grace in a glass, and I'm going to hand it to you. Okay? And I want you to drink it. If I ever give you Kool-Aid, run. Okay? But if I give you grace, drink it, all right? Listen to me. God made a covenant with us, just as Jonathan made a covenant with David. He made a covenant before the foundations of the earth were ever laid. Before you breathed. Before you were born. God, being infinitely superior, initiated the covenant. Us, being infinitely lesser, were the benefactors, the recipients, and it was all done for our good. He, God, entered into a blood covenant with you, a covenant totally based and completely based on love, radical love, pure love, profound love. This covenant is the gospel. It is an announcement. It has already been done. And you and I are just the benefactors. And he fulfills the covenant with no help from us. Jesus, what was he called? The friend of sinners. What are you called when you enter into a covenant with the people? A friend. Jesus, lifting up his arms, revealing the shedding of blood, covenant. Jesus, wearing on his body the scars even after the resurrection. And he tells Thomas to put your hand right here in my side. Look at the wounds. These are memorials of the covenant that I have made. Jesus, what did he do before he was betrayed? On the night he was betrayed, he took bread. And he broke it and he passed it out and he took the cup. What did he do? He shared a meal, sealing the covenant that he had made. Jesus, the cross and the tomb are memorial sites of where the covenant was sealed, and everyone can see it and remember it. The whole thing was a dramatic display of a covenant God had made before we were born, and he put it all on display that we might see it and remember it. He made the covenant. It originated in him. He swore to fulfill the covenant by taking an oath to himself. Scripture says he took an oath to himself because there was nobody greater to take an oath by. So he swore the oath to himself. He shares in the meal, the communion. He lifts up his arms, and by the breaking of bread, holding up the cup, stretching out his arms on the cross, he sheds his own blood. He bears the scars. The cross is a memorial. It's all a fulfillment of the covenant. And remember, once a covenant is made, it is non-negotiable and cannot be altered. You have no idea how safe you are in him. You have no idea how secure you are in him. None. It doesn't matter. Listen to me. It does not matter if you hold up your end of the deal. It doesn't matter if sometimes you can't find faith. Are we good now? All right. That was not planned, by the way. It doesn't matter, Jay, if you screw up. He's the guy on lights, by the way. It doesn't matter if you mess up, if you're weak, if you're tired, if you're apprehensive, if you're tempted, or you're just plain stupid. You didn't originate the covenant. It wasn't your blood. You didn't swear by yourself. He initiated the covenant. He fulfills the covenant. It is non-negotiable and cannot be altered. The fulfillment of the covenant does not depend on you. Do you realize what happens inside a person when they finally see that? When they finally understand that? When it finally goes off inside of them? It is like you have been born again. It is like you have been resurrected from the dead. 1 John 3. See, this is what John says. See what great love the Father has what? Lavished on us. See what great love the Father has lavished on us, that you, man, with all your stupidity. Come on, you. Look at your husband right now. Just think about that. God has lavished love on that man. Look at your wife with all her imperfections, all her problems, all her dumb decisions. Look at your husband with all his idiocies and his weird ways and all. God, we should be called children of God. Does your husband look like a child of God? Does your wife look like a child of God? When you get up in the morning, you look over at her. Does she look like a child of God? When you look at him in the morning and his breath is 3 feet long, does he look like a child of God? But that's what John says. See what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God, and that is what we are. The reason the world does not know us is that it did not know him. Dear friends, dear what? We're all in a covenant together, are we not? Dear friends, now we are children of God. And what we will be has not yet been made known. It gets better and better and better. But we know that when Christ appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Colossians 3 and 4. For you died. You died. You died. And your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, not your life, he is your life, appears, then you will also be with him in glory. That's how you should think. We are a new creation. All that belonged to the old creation is over. The old system of keeping score. This is the gospel. You want the gospel? Here's the gospel. The old system of keeping score. Who's ahead? Who's behind? Who's winning? Who's losing? Who's living right? Who's sinning? All of that has been eradicated, eliminated, destroyed, and removed. Do you see it? Do you see it? We are Mephibosheth. We didn't earn it. We didn't work for it. We're not even that loyal to David. In fact, sometimes we don't even like David. But it doesn't have anything to do with us. We're dead and hidden in Christ. We were born after the covenant was made. What in the world did you have to do with it? Nothing. But yet we are heirs of all the benefits. It has nothing to do with us. It has nothing to do with our behavior. It has nothing to do with us. It has nothing to do with our love for God, our faithfulness. Man, if the whole thing depended on your love for God, you might as well quit. If it all depends on your faithfulness, man, you're secure one day and not secure the next. It doesn't have anything to do with your support and your surrender and your amount of faith. It has everything to do with Jesus and the covenant he made. And one day, when this whole thing is wrapped up, you know what? We are going to sit at the king's table. And we're going to eat. And every now and then, I think we're going to look under the table. We're going to see, wow, this lame boy made it. And you're going to look over at somebody else and say, and you made it too? You made it too? Yeah. I'd have never made it if it had to do with my love, my faithfulness, my goodness, my effort, my works. But I got in not because of anything I did, but because of everything he did. I am just a benefactor of the covenant God made. This lame boy is going to sit at the king's table all of eternity. And you know what I'm going to do? Thank God I made it in. That is the gospel. It is an announcement of what has already been done, and you get to ride in for free. Let's pray. Father, grace, 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 grace. May we drink it straight and don't mix anything with it. God, help us to see it so clearly. It goes off inside of us and changes us. Changes the way we think, the way we behave. We'll start looking around and seeing other people and just want to go tell them the announcement. Tell them the good news. Father, when we begin to see that you have let us in based on nothing that we have ever done right, and you don't keep us out because of what we do wrong, it is all based on you and you alone, your covenant, what you have done. God, it will change the way we live. It will change the way we talk. It'll change the way we think. It'll change what we sing. It'll change what we say. It'll change everything about us because the gospel births us over and we start seeing the entire universe differently. God, open our eyes, open our minds, open our hearts, and may we see the gospel in action. We thank you. We honor you. We worship you. In his name, the name that is above every name, Jesus. Amen. Isn't that good news? Listen, if you are here this morning and you need prayer for any reason, we have some prayer team members here who will stay with you, pray with you about anything. It doesn't matter what it is. Do not forget. Tullian is going to be with us October 5th right here in the auditorium. Our men's conference is going to be very intimate. We're going to have tables set up in here. We're going to have discussion. We're going to be learning. We're going to be talking. And I'm telling you, Tullian brings a message of grace that is so powerful, so incredible. He's going to be here on that Saturday. He's going to be in both services on that Sunday morning. Guys, literally $20. $20, the first 50 people, $20 covers your breakfast, lunch, conference, the whole thing right here. Don't forget to sign up for that, men. You do not want to miss it. October 5th, our Momentum Men's Conference. Thank you for being here. Have an incredible day.